You were responsible for bringing Life back as a monthly. How do you think the new Life differs from the old Life? How is it a different magazine?
Well, it can't cover the news anymore, and therefore it's lost one of its largest franchises. It can do a large amount of what the old Life did. I mean, it can use photography in an incredible way. It can deal with very moving and marvelous essays, and it can delve behind the news and enlighten people in ways that the old magazine really didn't do. It can be funny, it can be sad, it can look back, it can look forwards, it can move you, it can be serious, it can inform, it can do all kinds of things, just as a human being can. I mean, the reason I worked so hard to bring it back, I worked on the old Life for 22 years and then put out 10 special issues during the time it wasn't around, all the time working to bring it back. The reason I worked so hard is because I always figured that Life magazine was just about the best magazine idea that had ever come along. To tell pictures, to tell stories in pictures, not to have any set format, to be able to do anything, to have a magazine with a real personality, which felt things, which could laugh, which could cry, which could inform. Marvelous format to get to people and to interest the world. And I felt that it should not be away from the American scene for good.
Can you state for me an overview of the changing status of Life, the fact that it was around as a weekly, what happened to it, and what it is today?
Well, it's a much smaller operation today. It used to be kind of the national organ. You hadn't finished your week unless you'd read Life magazine in the old days. And that's no longer true, a lot because of television and a lot because of its monthly status, but it's still a very interesting magazine.
What is the project that you've been working on for the last year and a half?
Well, it's a fascinating project, and it kind of caps my career of 33 years of working in the magazine. I was asked to go through every single issue of Life from the very beginning in 1936 until today, almost 2,000 issues, and try to create a book out of what I found. And the wealth of material almost drowned me, but I did come up with a format, and the book is done, and it's going to be published in September by Little Brown. I learned a lot about the magazine that I didn't know before.
All right, well, from what you saw in putting the book together, did Life take stands on things? Did Life ever go out on a limb and take an editorial stand, or was it wishy-washy, or where was it?
Life was anything but wishy-washy, and it definitely took stands. It had an editorial page to discuss the rights and wrongs of different issues, but its stories themselves hit hard, and there was no question about what side it was on.
Where would the subject of race fit into that?
Well, Life decided early on that race was one of the most important subjects, most important things in the American scene, and got behind the race movement like crazy.
All right, on that same line, how do you link, or how would you discuss Martin Luther King as a part of its race coverage, the violence and the the bloodshed on one hand and his pacifism on the other. Was King a hero of life, and didn't he go against the type of reporting that they were doing on the race scene?
We weren't participants in the violence. We were photographing it and writing about it, and applauding Martin Luther King for not striking back. I mean, the most natural thing to do would be to raise arms against all this dogs and clubs and guns and that were being used against black people in the South. And with his great restraint, with his belief in God, and with his calm approach to everything, he overcame. He really did.
As far as life-taking stands, though, do you think race was one of the strongest stands it took?
I think it was, yes. I mean, certainly in the dealing with crime in the 1960s, the investigative reporting was fiercely anti-mafia. There was no question about that. In politics, we were either for somebody or against somebody on our editorial page constantly. I think that the staff probably believed in the racial struggle more than any other issue.
Do you think it made any difference, Life's coverage?
I think that Life's coverage of the racial struggle in the United States made a huge difference. At least I hope so.
We're doing a story on Jill Kinmont today. So what are the elements that make that such a poignant, successful story? What are those ingredients?
Well, a certain kind of life essay, a very emotional, human one, had ingredients such as calamity and then great strength to overcome that calamity. A very good example of that kind of story was Jill Kinmont, the Olympic skier who crashed and was paralyzed and still made a life for herself with unbelievable courage.
Good. Would that be considered a photo essay?
A typical life essay is a story told in a series of pictures, none of which can really tell a story alone, but the sum total tells it very strongly. A good example of such a story was Jill Kinmont's accident and the years that followed. We covered Jill several times. She was a hopeful Olympic skier who crashed, was paralyzed, and fought her way back. It was heart-wrenching, but it was uplifting as well.
In going over all of Life's World War II coverage, it seems that a lot of those stories were not just written about soldiers, but for soldiers. You think that's true?
Well, I think it became evident to the editors early on that life was part and parcel of a soldier's life. He would come out of the front lines, and one of the first things he'd ask for, along with his mail, was a copy of Life magazine, which showed him what was going on at home. He didn't have to read any long essays to tell it. He just looked at those pictures and gobbled them up. And I think the editors of Life felt this and started aiming some of their stories to the fighting men. One good example of that was when they actually showed them the kind of kisses that awaited them when they got home.
What about, give me another example of what they might do for the soldiers.
Well, they did a whole special issue for the soldiers. It was called Letter to the GIs, and it really summed up America for the soldiers and sailors and Marines overseas, telling what was going on, what was changing, how they could expect to view their families and their friends when they got back, how they had changed, and in general, it was aimed right at them.
There was so much of that early coverage of the war. Was Life a war magazine? How would you define Life during that period?
Well, I'd define Life during World War II as a war magazine. Its pages were absolutely filled with not only war, but war-related stories. Henry Luce, its founder, once said that we did not start out making Life a war magazine, but it certainly ended up as a war magazine. I don't think it ended up as a war magazine. I think it ended up as the war magazine.
In going through those pages, Life's coverage of early man or man in nature, was that something they would follow up on?
Yeah, that's the subject of early man intrigued the editors of Life from the start. There's something mysterious and wonderful to look back before history and see how man lived at that point. And whenever they could find examples of this, they leapt on them. One of the best stories of this nature was done by our great photographer Elliot Elshoffen.
Great. What about something that Life did better than anybody, which is stopping the action, using the camera to illustrate stopped action? Can you tell us about that?
Stopping the action was an absolute basic ingredient of the magazine from the start. Showing people what they could not see with the naked eye. And I think some of the very first pictures of stopped action were the early strobe light pictures, when a bullet was caught in midair, fired from a gun, or a drop of milk hitting a pail of milk, and the beautiful design it made. Well, Ripple Rock was a very good example of stopped action, where an enormous explosion, where they were clearing rock out of a river. Even more so was the nuclear blast at Yucca Flats, where Life built a tower and put very thick glass housing around its automatic cameras, and actually caught the shock wave as it hit a 8-room house that had been constructed to see if it could possibly stand the blast. The pictures of that are extraordinary.
What about sneaked pictures? Was it something that Life did or liked to do?
Sneak pictures could be fun, and they could be serious. The earliest one I can remember is a thief, a minor thief, I guess, stealing a bottle of milk, and the bottle had been rigged up so that it set off the camera if it was moved. There were pictures of a cremation, of guillotining, of a duel which was not allowed. So all those pictures were sneaked. There were other kinds of pictures that were smuggled out of countries that were also sneaked when they were taken. The arrest of a dissident behind the Iron Curtain, Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi killer, stomping around his cell in Israel before his death sentence. There were many.
And another thing Life liked to do was list things. Is that true? Did you find that?
Life has always delighted in being encyclopedic in its approach on a lot of subjects. To show all of something is fun, and they, at one time or another, have shown all the food a American family eats in a year in one picture, or all the license plates in the United States, or all the capitals, or all the birthplaces of all the presidents. They love to do that. On a more serious note, we have treated war in a similar manner. In 1943, Life ran 26 pages, a story that had no pictures in it, that had 26 pages of solid print, the names, the telephone book listing of 1,300 people, the men, every man who had died so far, every American who had died so far in the first 18 months of the war. 26 years later, as the Vietnam War raged, they would repeat the technique.
We have a piece on D-Day and the man crawling ashore that Robert Capa photographed in Normandy. What else did Life report on in that issue?
The issue that had the D-Day story in it, those extraordinary pictures by Robert Capa of men landing on the shores of Normandy, had other stories in it that complemented them and enriched them. One was a story on Eisenhower's son graduating from West Point. Mamie was there, and he was going through all the traditions that his father had gone through decades before, while his father at that very moment was in charge of this monstrous invasion, the largest invasion in history. And I think that kind of although they weren't played side by side, they happened to be in the same issue, that kind of thing enriched both stories tremendously.
Let's talk about Anniversaries. This is the 50th, but Life has had many others. It almost seems like Life delights in its own anniversaries.
Well, Life has had quite a few anniversaries, not many anniversary parties, but it has taken note of its anniversaries on its cover, starting with when it was 1 year old. It had a 1-year-old baby, and when it was 10, it had a 10-year-old blowing out 10 candles. Later on, it did have some lavish parties, and it usually turned to the great entertainers of the day, the great favorites of Life, too, to help them celebrate.
Life has had a tradition of turning towards those performers. Can you link Life's anniversaries in the past with turning to performers for help?
There have been, in the past, when television was young, in Life's 20th year and its 25th year, there were extensive television shows on those birthdays, and Life at that time turned to some of their favorite performers to help with the celebration.
If you could state for me, Life had the greatest staff of photographers on earth, and yet a lot of the pictures were freelance pictures. How would you justify calling a picture that was not taken by a Life photographer a Life photograph?
Once, I think it was in the early 1960s or late 1950s, Ed Thompson, the great managing editor of Life, convened all the staff photographers from all over the world, remarkable staff, At one point, they were all called into New York for a meeting, and a marvelous picture was taken of them at that time. But that staff, no matter how marvelous it was, could not cover the world. Things happened in faraway places that their cameras could not see. And so Life was also picked up pictures, bought pictures from agencies and freelancers and services. It published, in Henry Luce's words, early words, the cream of the world's pictures. And as soon as those pictures, whoever took them, hit the pages of Life, they became Life pictures.
What about children? Is that a subject matter that Life took a special interest in?
Well, it would be impossible to do Life magazine, in my opinion, without covering lots of children. In miniature, they show us what we're all about. They make us laugh. They make us see the future. They make us optimistic. And they're the most wonderful creatures in the world.
What about the miscellany page? How would you describe that to someone who had not ever heard of it before?
The miscellany page was a way to say goodbye each week. Amazingly enough, most of the readers said hello by it, by turning to it first. It was so immediate in its effect. It really needed no writing or captions to explain it. It was a picture of an animal or a child or a happening that was amusing. Some of them were side-splitting, some of them were poignant. All of them were interesting and wonderful little images of life in this world.
The last category, animals. Is that something that they took an interest in?
Life was always entranced by animals, especially wild animals, and it mounted enormous safaris and trips into the wilderness to try to capture the lives of these animals on film. Those trips brought us some of the great stories.
Finally, Life in Hollywood. It seemed to be able to do anything with actors. What was that relationship?
The relationship between Hollywood actors and Life magazine was a two-way relationship. We gave those actors an enormous amount of publicity by putting them on our cover and by doing stories about them inside magazine. And they in turn cooperated with us and did some pretty amazing and outlandish things too. In 1957, a host of them gave up their time and energies into creating a wonderful package for our entertainment issue. Cary Grant imitated Charlie Chaplin. Bing Crosby and Bob Hope played gangsters. Frank Sinatra was there. Just about everybody who was anybody in Hollywood at that point said yes to our entreaties.
Life was known for a lot of different types of stories. What do you think the ingredients were or what were some of the favorite ingredients of a Life story, and what's an example of that story?
The ingredients for a moving human essay, of which Life published many, and certainly was the best magazine at doing so that ever came about, were triumph over adversity, were courage in the face of catastrophe, were overcoming great odds. A good example of this would be the story we did on Jill Kinmont, the Olympic skier who crashed, was paralyzed, and over the years fought her way back in the most courageous way.
Can you one more time tell us about Life's coverage of race and specifically Martin Luther King, the violent side of the race war as opposed to his pacifism and Life taking a stand?
Well, in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s, when the race wars in the United States were at their height, Life covered the violence thoroughly and well and courageously, and was most impressed, I think, by the courage of the pacifist Martin Luther King, who instead of fighting back, instead of leading his troops against the antagonists, turned the other cheek.
All right, and in bringing Life back as a monthly, you made a point about Life actually having a personality. What is the personality of Life magazine, as you see it?
The personality and character of Life magazine is and has been many-sided, and that's one of the wonderful things about the magazine, that it can be one thing one minute and another thing another minute. It can be humorous. It can look at the world with a wry eye. It can be stern. It can be informational. It can rap knuckles. It can show the most awful scenes and then the most tender. Oh, George.
Cut.